On the last cold morning of February in 1985 in Hardin County, Iowa, a man named Elmer Voss carried a cardboard box out of his farmhouse and set it in the bed of his pickup. Then he went back inside and carried out another, and another. By the time the sun cleared the shelter belt, there were 11 boxes lined up in that truck bed, each one taped shut and labeled in pencil, and every one of them full of paper, receipts. Nothing but receipts, feed store slips, fuel invoices, cancelled checks, little yellow carbons from the co-op going back near 20 years. His neighbor, Dale Kuffner, watched from across the road, coffee going cold in his hand, and he laughed the way you laugh at something you can't make sense of. Everybody knew Elmer kept every scrap, kept string, kept nails in coffee cans sorted by size. The whole county had a soft joke about it. Voss don't throw away a thing but daylight. That morning, the bank was going to sell his farm on the courthouse steps, and Elmer Voss was loading boxes of old paper into a truck like a man packing for a trip. They thought he'd finally cracked. They were about to find out he was the only one in the county who'd been paying attention. If stories of stubbornness, quiet faith, and the long memory of ordinary people mean something to you, take a second and subscribe. Join our farming family here, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd like knowing who's out there in the dark, listening. Now, back to Elmer and those 11 boxes. The Voss place sat on 320 acres of black clarion loam, northwest of Iowa Falls. Ground so rich it near about grew corn out of spite. Elmer's grandfather, Otto Voss, broke the first sod there in 1911 with a walking plow and 2 Percherons named Kaiser and June. 3 generations put their backs into that dirt. Corn, soybeans, and a farrowing operation that ran 40 sows in a good year. Elmer took it over in 1961 when his father's heart quit in the hog lot on a Tuesday. He was not a big talker. Elmer watched more than he spoke. At the co-op, he'd stand at the edge of a conversation, hands in his coveralls, and you'd forget he was there until he said one true thing and left. He wasn't cold. He'd pull your combine out of the mud at midnight and never mention it. He just didn't waste words, the same way he didn't waste string. He had his failings too. He was slow to trust and slower to forgive. His wife, Margaret, said he could hold a grudge the way a fence post holds barbed wire, and it took her 30 years to teach him to let some things go. He never fully learned, but the part of him that couldn't let go was, it turned out, the part that saved everything. The receipts weren't his idea, not really. They came from Otto. Otto Voss had lived through the first foreclosure wave. The one in the 1920s and 30s when the banks came through this country like a hailstorm and took farms that had been in families since the Homestead Act. Otto watched neighbors lose everything on a banker's word against their own, because they had no paper and the bank had all of it. And he swore an oath in his own kitchen that a Voss would never again stand in front of a judge with empty hands. He kept a ledger, a big canvas-bound book, and inside the front cover he'd written in German script a line Elmer's father translated for him as a boy. The bank has a memory. So must we. When Otto died in 1958, that ledger passed to Elmer, along with a shoebox of Depression-era mortgage papers Otto had never thrown away. Elmer read them by lamplight as a young man. He understood, and he started keeping everything. He didn't explain himself. That was his way. Now here is the part worth slowing down for, because it's the part nobody in Hardin County understood until it was almost too late. In the early 1980s, American farming fell into the worst crisis since the Depression. It came from numbers, not weather. In the 1970s, the government urged farmers to plant fence to fence and borrow to expand, and land prices climbed like they'd never stop. Then in 1981, the Federal Reserve, fighting runaway inflation, pushed interest rates to heights nobody had seen. The prime rate hit 21.5%. Loans that had been signed at 7% now carried crushing weight. And Iowa farmland, which had only ever gone up, began to fall. Between 1981 and 1986, the value of an acre of Iowa ground dropped by roughly 60%. A man could owe more on his land than the land was worth, through no fault of his own hands. The banks got desperate, and desperate lenders cut corners. Here is the mechanism, the thing Elmer understood that his neighbors did not. When a farmer sent in a payment, the bank was supposed to apply it in a set order, first to interest, then to principal, and to record the date it was received. But an overwhelmed bank, or a dishonest one, could misapply those payments, post them late so a late fee stuck, credit them to the wrong account, slide the money to interest when it should have touched principal, so the balance never seemed to shrink. And then there was force-placed insurance, which was legal but ripe for abuse. If a bank claimed you'd let your crop or property coverage lapse, it could buy a policy on your behalf at several times the going rate and add it straight to your loan. Do that quietly, month after month, and a man who was current on his real obligations could be shown, on paper, to be thousands in arrears. The bank's numbers were a story, and whoever held the paper got to tell it. Almost nobody could argue back. Most farmers kept a checkbook and a prayer. When the bank's statement said you were behind, because you had nothing to set against it. But a man who had every cancelled check, every deposit slip, every dated receipt for 20 years. A man who could lay his own record beside the bank's and show exactly where the two diverged. That man had something rare. That man had a memory as long as the bank's, Farmers' Savings, the little bank in the county seat that carried the Voss note, had been bought out in 1982 by a bigger holding company out of Des Moines. New men, new methods. In the fall of 1983, Elmer's statements started coming back wrong. A late fee for a payment he'd mailed on time. Then an insurance charge, $118.40 for coverage he already carried through his own agent and had the policy to prove it. Then the balance stopped moving even as he paid. He went in, calm, with a folder. The loan officer, a young man named Bracker, maybe 28, told him the computer didn't make mistakes and he must be confused. Elmer went home. He didn't yell. He started reconciling. It took him most of a winter at the kitchen table under the lamp with Otto's old adding machine and a legal pad. The first time through, his own math didn't close, and he thought maybe he was the fool they said. He'd missed a fuel slip that fell behind a drawer. He found it, started over. Then in the spring of 1984, the basement took 8 inches of water in a bad thaw, and 3 boxes of the oldest receipts turned to pulp before he got to them. He dried what he could on the porch railing, sheet by sheet. And for the ones lost, he wrote to the co-op and the feed store and the fuel man. And one by one, those old country businesses dug into their own back rooms and sent him copies. Small-town paper has a long life if you ask nice. And once, in the middle of it all, the barn cat knocked a lamp into a box and scorched a corner of the 1979 ledger. He copied every page by hand before the smell was gone. 3 times the work came undone. 3 times he sat back down and did it again. He never complained. Margaret would find him there at 2 in the morning, and he'd say only, "Getting closer," and she'd go back to bed. Because she'd married a man who finished things. By November of 1984 it closed. Every column! And the truth sat there on the legal pad in his square pencil hand. Elmer Voss was not behind. Farmers' Savings had misapplied 11 payments, charged him for 2 years of insurance he never needed and never authorized, and compounded the whole invented shortfall into a default. By their paper, he owed enough to lose the farm. By his, he was current and they owed him. He wrote the bank a letter. They filed for foreclosure anyway. The sale was set for the courthouse steps, the last day of February, 1985. The animals knew before the people did. That's an old saying in this country, and old sayings earn their keep. The week before the sale, the hogs went restless and off their feed, and Elmer's stock dog wouldn't leave the porch. And the night before, the barometer fell so hard that Harlan Prue, who was 81 and had farmed through everything, stood in his yard at dusk and looked at a sky the color of old brass and told his grandson a change was coming. He wasn't talking about the weather. Harlan had seen desperate men before, and he'd never seen Elmer Voss desperate. That's what scared him. Auction morning came grey and still. A crowd gathered on the courthouse steps because a farm sale in 1985 drew a crowd the way a funeral does, half from sympathy and half from the plain dread of your own name being next. The bank's lawyer stood up top in a good coat. Bracker was there, and above him a vice president down from Des Moines named Colwell, a tall man who checked his watch like the whole thing was already over. Then Elmer's truck pulled up, and he started carrying boxes. He set them on the courthouse steps, one after another, 11 of them, and he opened the ledger on top and asked, in a voice quiet enough that people leaned in, to see the bank's accounting of his loan entered into the record before any sale went forward. It was his right, and the county sheriff conducting the sale allowed it. What happened next didn't take an hour. Elmer laid his record beside theirs. He had a witness he'd hired with the last cash he had, a retired bank examiner from Cedar Falls named Ruth Ann Dealey, 63, sharp as a tack, who'd spent 30 years reading exactly these kinds of ledgers. She went through it in front of everyone. Payment received here, posted there, 11 days late by their own stamp, late fee attached. Insurance charged on a property already insured. Here's the farmer's own policy, same dates. Line by line by line, his paper against theirs. And every single time the two disagreed, his had a date and a signature and a cancelled check behind it, and theirs had a keystroke. The crowd got very quiet. This was not a thing they'd seen. A farmer was not supposed to be able to fight the numbers. Colwell came down the steps. He stood over the open ledger for a long moment, and he read, and the watch stayed in his pocket. Ruth Ann pointed to one figure, and then to Elmer's cancelled check for the same, and she didn't say anything. She just let him look. Colwell straightened up. Everybody waited. I was wrong, he said. That was all, no speech. He told the sheriff to stop the sale, and he told Bracker to get the file, and he walked back to his car alone. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of morning. Dale Kuffner, who'd laughed at those boxes for 20 years, took off his cap and held it, and didn't say a word, which for Dale was the loudest thing he could have done. The farm did not sell. Within the month, the holding company, facing a farmer with 2 decades of airtight paper and a retired examiner willing to testify, settled quiet. They reversed the charges, corrected the balance, forgave what their own errors had cost, and wrote off the case rather than let it into a courtroom where the whole practice might come to light. Elmer signed the papers at the same kitchen table under the same lamp. He kept a copy. Of course he did. He never gloated. When the neighbors asked how he'd done it, he'd shrug and say, "Kept my papers." That was his way, but something moved through the county that spring. Quiet, the way real things move. A farmer over by Alden started saving his receipts in a metal box. Then a woman near Ackley pulled out her records and found the same insurance charge on her note and got it reversed. Then 3 families in the next township down did the same. Nobody organized it. There was no meeting. A man would mention it over a truck hood, or a wife would hear it at church. Keep your paper, lay it beside theirs. And it went from there. It just spread, the way useful things do. By the end of that year, the little independent bank in the county seat had gotten a great deal more careful about how it posted a payment, because the farmers were watching now, and the farmers had memories. Wendell Berry once wrote, "The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all our most pleasing responsibility." And I think about that when I think about Elmer Voss and his 11 boxes. Because the thing he was really caring for all those years wasn't the paper. The paper was just how it showed. What he was tending was the truth, kept plain and dated and honest against the day someone would try to tell him a different one. The farm was never the real harvest. Any man can lose a farm. What Elmer saved was something the bank couldn't foreclose on, the simple, stubborn proof of what actually happened. He paid attention to what everybody else threw away. He did the boring work, in the cold, alone, 3 times over, when it would have been so much easier to trust the computer and lose everything. And in the end, the whole county learned what Otto Voss knew in a depression kitchen 50 years before. The bank has a memory. So must we. Elmer farmed that ground another 19 years. His grandson works it now. And somewhere in that farmhouse, I'd bet, there's still a box of receipts, taped shut, labeled in pencil. Have you ever been laughed at for being careful? For keeping the thing everybody told you to throw away? For doing it slow and doing it right when the whole world said don't bother? I'd like to hear about it. Tell me your story down in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether it's a farmhouse or a city apartment or a truck cab at a rest stop. We read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us, because there are more like it, true to the bone, about ordinary people who paid attention when it mattered. We'll see you at the next one.